Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Ben Wilder. I am the director of the Desert Laboratory on Tumamoc Hill, and it is great to have you with us this evening. I'd like to start by recognizing where I'm talking to you from tonight. I'm talking to you from Tumamoc Hill, known as Atam as Chimamagi Duag, Horned Lizard Mountain, on the ancestral lands of the Sabaipuri and Dona Atam peoples. This volcanic hill is of prominent ancestral, cultural, and sacred significance to the Atam nations, including the Don Atam Nation, Gila River Indian Community, Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, the Akchin Indian Community, the Hopi tribe, and the Pasco Yaqui tribe. The Desert Laboratory recognizes the cultural significance of Chimamagi Duag as the bedrock of our institution and our future actions. The lecture series that we're talking to you about tonight, and we're welcome to you, the spring lecture series called Agave Renaissance, is very much in step with the connection of people and to the land. I want to first thank the Friends of Tumamoc who make series like this possible through your contributions to helping us be better stewards of this site. So thank you for renewing your support recently or considering to do so, and just being friends with us in so many ways. For this lecture series, we are very excited to be partnering with El Crisol of Doug and Amy Smith, of also connected to XO Coffee, as well as Todd Hanley and Elise Shepard and the whole crew over at Hotel Congress. And Todd, Doug, myself, and many other people had an opportunity almost a year ago to go down to Mexico, to Guadalajara and Michoacan areas on a trip organized by David Suro, who's going to be with us tomorrow night in the second part of the first kickoff of our series here, on a trip to really connect with and understand and learn in part the heartland of agave culture and mezcal production. And in many ways, that trip was such an inspiration and really helped inspire, I think, some of the elements of this lecture series, which is reconnecting to such a vibrant connection, really, to between plants and people. And really the overriding mission of this series is that we need better examples and models of where humans can coexist with the plants and animals around us, where we have a positive relationship with the biodiversity on this planet. And unfortunately, those examples are very few these days, but there's more than you would think. And agave is one of the most powerful such examples. So we are going to be digging in deep to that very topic through this series. So deep, in fact, that we needed to have a whole other night and double the amount of content we can cover. And so each of these lectures is going to be a presentation on a Wednesday night, just like this, and then followed by the subsequent evening on Thursday evening, which is going to be more of a tasting. And so that will include the tasting of distilled agave spirits, mezcal, bacanora, Tricia, La Chuguilla. Will be introducing to all sorts of things. But really the point of that is to continue to the discussion. One of the things that I've been learning so much as I've dug into this topic here on Tumamoc, and then also down in more further south in Mexico, is the infinite varieties and nuances of how people interact with this plant, with this, over 250 plus named species, but then also how this species, how agave interacts with people, and the varieties and the really gray zones in between, how this species has evolved and morphed into what we call, what we try to apply names to, but are just really gradients in terms of the species adaptations to aridity, but also the driving selection by people. So we have over 16 different speakers, and honestly, couldn't be more excited to get into this topic with you all and to explore this. And I could not think of a better person to kick us off than Wendy Hodgson. We are so fortunate and really just honored to have Wendy be able to present to us this evening. So let me just give you all just a bit of a snippet of how awesome Wendy is, and tell you about some of her work. So Wendy Hodgson has lived in and loved the Sonoran Desert for more than 50 years. Her areas of interest and study include floristics of the Southwest US and Northern Mexico, rare and endemic plants, and taxonomy and systematics of agave, yucca, and Hesperal yucca, including the study of pre-Columbian agave cultivars. For 30 years, she has studied and documented the flora of the Grand Canyon region, including the evolution and distribution of certain plant groups as affected by the area's unique factors. She apparently gravitates towards spiny plants, as she also loves to study and make herbarium specimens of Southwest US cacti and more recently, thistles. A glutton for punishment, Wendy, that's not easy work. With the research staff of the Desert Botanical Garden, where she's Emerita curator of the herbarium there, working with many associates, including Donald Pinkava, she coordinated completion of the cactus family treatment for the intermountain flora. She's also an ethnobotanist, particularly interested in the relationship of pre and post-contact Native Americans with their desert food plants. For anybody that may not be familiar with Wendy's Sonoran Desert Food Plants book, Google it, buy it. It's a must-have, just an incredible contribution, and a wonderful go-to. So much knowledge in there. Wendy is an avid plant collector who strives towards making high-quality herbarium specimens in difficult-to-collect groups like Agaves and Cactaceae. Just before I hand it over to Wendy, just one minor rules of the road here. If you all have questions during the presentation, please enter them into the question and answer, the Q&A little box in your Zoom window. You'll see it there. Type it in. You can do it at any point. We're going to be collecting those as we go, and then I'll be moderating your questions to Wendy towards the end of the evening. We do not have a strict 7 p.m. deadline here. We're going to let it go as the conversation takes us, but we'll definitely be respectful of your time and probably be ending between 7:15, 7:30. We'll see in there. So settle in, get comfortable. It's a new day here for all of us. Rain is on the way. We are honored to have you join us for this series. And Wendy, thank you so much. And I'll let you take it from there.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ben, for that really nice introduction. And thank you for asking me to be the first speaker in this really great series, lecture series. And I'm so looking forward to all the great talks that are going to be presented in the next few months and interesting too. And I feel very honored and I look at the lecturers, I mean, some have and continue to be my mentors. So I'm really quite humbled and honored. So thank you. And thank you to everybody who is joining us tonight. So tonight I would like to share with you some of my thoughts on this wonderful agave human symbiotic relationship, with focusing on arid regions and focusing even more on our borderlands region, including the Sonoran Desert in Arizona and northern Sonora. So just a little background here. And it pains me to say this, that the agaves are now in the Asparagaceae, subfamily Agavoideae. And there are about 210 species found in southwestern US and Florida, South Latin America, to Paraguay, and also in the Caribbean. And the greatest diversity is in central Mexico, and that's where the center of origin is believed too. And worldwide, 61% are endemic to Mexico. And within Mexico, 81% are endemic. And most have very localized distributions. It's a young genus. Researchers believe possibly originated about 10 million years ago. And it's been very successful, radiating into arid and semi-arid regions, such as in our region here. And they play a very important ecological role in their ecosystems, including arid regions. So there are many traits, far more than I'm going to list here, that allow many to survive in the so-called quote unquote marginal, but great area for these agaves that have adapted to these arid regions. And some of the traits, for example, rosettes at or near the soil surface. It helps the water collection so that can be taken up by shallow roots. Generally, there's a trend towards rosette size decreasing with increased aridity, as well as when you increase the northerly latitudes, the rosette size decreases as well. With arid agaves, they tend to have low germination rates and rely more and more on vegetative reproduction through the form of pupping, offsets from underground rhizomes, underground stems called rhizomes. And of course, there's leaf and stem succulents, and this varies greatly. Tony Burgess did a wonderful study on agaves in one of the driest areas in North America, the Vizcaíno. And he did show a great variation even within species, but there were adaptations depending on the climate and the aridity.
Wendy, I'm just gonna pause. Sorry to interrupt you. I don't know if you press the start share button for your screen. Are you intending for us to see your screen right now?
I did say that. Yeah, I'm
Okay,
sorry.
cool. Well, you have us wrapped with attention without any visuals, so don't worry.
Oh no. So I hit share screen. So you see it?
And maybe select the window you want to display. We can't see it yet, no.
Oh.
There we are.
Oh, I am so sorry. Okay, let me back up a little bit here. How about that? You see that now?
We're rocking and rolling, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Let's get rid of that. Okay, let's back up a little bit. I'll go through it really fast. Okay?
Oh, good. Thanks.
Or should I just continue from here?
I would just take it from there. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for letting me know, Ben. This would have been not very good to get to the end of the program. So, okay. And now it's not advancing. Uh-oh. Let's try this way. Gosh, it worked when we practiced it. Now
it's just advanced. I saw it advanced.
Oh, I just did it now. Okay. All right, gang. Let's try this again. So we have, so let's go down a little bit here. So you have a lower surface to volume ratio, and that often results in long, narrow leaves. Again, there's a lot of exceptions to this, even within species. And there's low stomatal densities, tend to have low number of stomates, and that's where you can lose water through transpiration, but it's also too, they're important for gas exchange. So it's a cost benefit ratio that's important to these plants. Thickness of cuticles. It's believed that with the thickness of cuticles, it reflects off heat, and so you don't get a heat buildup in the leaves, as well as slowing down water loss too. And of course, CAM metabolism. All agaves have that, where they open their stomates at night and gas exchange at nighttime. However, when with little small agaves, when they're just trying to establish themselves, young ones, they can revert back to C3 metabolism for growing quickly. Also in areas where, in populations that received a lot of moisture, the plants can revert back to C3. But CAM metabolism is the general rule. Also, there other adaptations include the production of fructans. These are the main carbohydrates stored in agaves, as well as about 15% of the families. And agavin was a recently discovered type of fructan found only in agaves. And we know that research has shown that fructans are beneficial to plants. They help protect against dehydration imposed by drought or freezing. But also, too, fructans are undigestible by humans, but And they're prebiotics that are fermented by probiotics. That's your bacteria, that's your gut bacteria. And that will, all the research is showing that that is beneficial to human health and decreasing triglyceride, cholesterol, and glucose levels, especially this kind of fructan called agave. And I mention this because the most common kind of fructan is inulin, that's from chicory root, and it's made up of linear molecules. But agave is highly branched, and there's some research that's showing that these highly branched molecules, fructans, may have more benefits to plants and possibly the humans than the more linear molecules. Other adaptations, I just learned this recently. I never heard of heat shock proteins. They're a ribosome inactivating protein, and this is very recent research. It was detected in the flower stalk bracts of Agave tequilana, variety azul, your tequila agave. And so when the agave is shooting up, it is protected. That shoot apical meristem is protected by the bracts, and it is within these bracts that you have the highest amount of these certain kind of proteins, and they believe that provided heat resistance. And they also suspect that it might increase drought and salt tolerance and pathogen resistance. So this is a pretty exciting area of study. What I think is really cool is, by the way, this is the first and only known kind of heat shock protein in the whole Agavoideae, the whole subfamily. And I think it's neat that they named it Mayahuelin after the famous agave goddess Mayuel. So I thought that was pretty cool. So they have all these traits and many more to help them adapt and then thrive in arid regions, including our Sonoran Desert, which has some of the driest, hottest areas in North America, and home to at least 2,500 plant species. It's probably more, but it is especially rich in cactus, agave, and legume families. It is also home to 30 indigenous groups. Over 55 indigenous groups had access to the Sonoran Desert resources. And as Gary Nabhan and many and others have often said, this region is a culturally and biologically rich region. As far as food plants, there are at least more than 500 plant species used for food. Again, your important families, cactus and legume, but also your nightshade family, grass family, and of course our agave family. Now, just like the agaves adapting to arid environments, so did the people. I love this paper. It's by Jenny Brand and Gary Nabhan. And they did a comparison study looking at Australian desert Aboriginal people and the plant foods that they ate, and compared them with Sonoran Desert peoples. And the parallels were striking, that first off, the many desert food plants in both these regions were slowly digested and absorbed, and that the desert dwellers in both regions have a GI tract and endocrine systems that were, quote, adapted to metabolize the many slow release complex carbohydrate foods in arid regions. And they call it this thrifty metabolism that possibly evolved with a feast or famine food supply. And in our own Sonoran Desert, we have so many plants that are slowly digested, slowly absorbed, contribute to low glycemic levels. You see the list there, and of course, agaves are one of them. So let's talk about agaves. Agave is life. I love this. Archaeobotanist Phil Daring called agaves the buffalo of the region. He was comparing the importance of agaves to the people here with the buffalo of the plains tribes. So many uses. There's fiber, and there's so many ways to use the fiber. The beverage, the pulques, the different mezcals, and we're going to hear a lot about these with the talks that will be presented later. Many other uses, over 70 uses or values of agaves. Of course, one of the most important is use for food. People have been using agaves for food for at least 10,000 years, a very long time. Not all agaves are edible. Those agaves that are high in sapogenins were generally avoided for food, but of course used for other purposes. the agaves that show signs when they're building up all the complex carbohydrates. Remember, they're in the form of fructans to shoot up this flower stalk. And so just when the stalk's emerging, like in this case, that's the time of harvest. Also, before you even see the stalk emerging, this was also a good time to harvest the plant. And you can see the innermost leaves spreading out here. That was the time to harvest the plant. This is a cross section. So you have your leaf bases, and then you have the heart of the plant. And that's what is baked after all the leaves are cut off. They are baked in a very intricate method. And this will be discussed in the talk I'm looking forward to in February. So this baking is just a superb method to break down those complex carbohydrates, mostly fructans, into simple sugars like fructose. And so one of the questions I had was, does it get rid of all the fructans? Because the people wouldn't get the benefits of fructans if it was all changed into fructose. And it turns out there was a study on baking with brick ovens, agave angustifolia, for 25 hours, and they found that not all the fructans were converted, like 15% were not. And this is good because it potentially could provide the benefits to the people, as well as not getting an overdose of fructans, which can also be bad. So after baking, you have this wonderful sweet. You have the leaf bases and the heart of the plant, and it can be eaten as is or dried for future use. And they can be dried up for a year or even more. So in our own Sonoran desert, we have a lot of edible agaves, and this isn't even all the agaves. This just shows the edible ones. And they were accessed through harvesting, direct harvesting, and through trade as well. One thing to note here is it sort of dwindles as you get into Arizona, the number of species. But these were really dependable food sources and nutritious, excellent source of calcium, and of course, because of the fructans, dietary fiber, good source of iron, potassium, and calories as well. So when I was doing my researching for my food plants book, I became really interested in Baja California tribes. I had no idea that there were 21 named tribes in Baja California. Don't seem to know, a lot of information on them, and there's a reason for that. All but the 5 most northern Baja groups became extinct by the late 1980s. But there is still information that could be had. This was an area that pearl fishermen visited, explorers, but when the Jesuit missionaries made it the goal to missionize the inhabitants of Baja California, starting in the 1690s with Salvatierra, that's when we actually were able to learn a lot more about these different groups. One of the groups I became interested in particularly was the Cochimí. And these people inhabited some of the driest places in North America, including like the Vizcaíno Desert. They're described as hunter-gatherers and quote unquote primitive because they didn't have pottery vessels, but they lived a more simple life, and I imagine they did just fine with what they with what they had, and we're not primitive by any stretch of the imagination. They believe they're a sister to human-speaking groups. We know a lot more about this group thanks in large part to a missionary, the Jesuit Miguel del Barco, who spent 30 years with the people. And he was unusual in that he really paid attention to the people. First he learned a language, and he wanted to learn the customs. And he was very good at documenting what he saw, which is very unusual for the rest of the missionaries. But he was very good. By the way, these great drawings are by another Jesuit missionary, Ignacio Terch, and he did several drawings of the people and the animals and plants. So he provided a lot of information, Del Barco, and it was published and in this publication here. But fortunately, you can get this publication. I got it from Dawson Bookshop, and it's translated into English, and it's a good translation. But what I really like about it too is that ethnologists as well as botanists, Annetta Carter there, made several notes in this publication, and which really adds to the value of this. So the Cochimi and the Agaves had a very tight relationship. They had access to at least 8 edible agave species. They preferred the smaller mescal ones to the larger introduced magueys. And surprising to me that the larger magueys, they were brought over from the mainland as early as the late 1600s. But the people preferred the little ones. These were not primitive people. They engaged in a very elaborate pit baking that was described in great detail by Del Barco. And as a matter of fact, Dr. Gentry included this description in his Agave monograph book. And I'd like to add too here that women did all the work, apparently. So I was curious too, the missionaries and the colonists, of course, want to stamp out all their cultural practices. They want to missionize these people, but they didn't stamp out all their practices. In this picture, this drawing shows these women, these Cochimi women, and they're wearing not their traditional dress, they're wearing European garb, but they're still going after the pitaya, the Oregon pipe cactus. And it was really good for the colonists and the missionaries that they let them go out and gather certain fruits, including agave as well, because often the ship didn't come in with supplies or their crops failed. And allowing them to collect the plants and harvest the plants actually saved their lives, the colonists' lives, on numerous occasions. Homer Ashman looked at this, and they were allowed to harvest them, but unfortunately, all the agaves around the missions became depleted, and so there's records of them having to go out so much farther away from the missions. And even in the 1960s, Ashman has said that ironically, the loss of Cochimi populations by the late 1800s into the early 1900s increased the agave densities. And I want to say too, this whole idea of them becoming extinct so late that it was only put in perspective for me, like 50, 60 years before I was born. So that puts it in perspective. So this wonderful agave-human relationship was championed, of course, by Howard Scott Gentry. And he gave a talk in 1975 where he wanted to stress the theme of mutualism by 2 disparate organisms. And he borrowed from David Prescott when David said, "Surely never did nature enclose in so compact a form so many elements of human comfort and civilization." And Dr. Gentry continued, "Man nurtured agave and agave nurtured man. Ancient Mexicans cultivated and coddled magueys incessantly, selecting all these genetic deviates and planting in them and with vegetative offsets so that you get so many kinds that man has been able to characterize and count. There's so many of them. And this led some people to think recently, maybe agaves were one of the earliest, if not the very first domesticate from Mesoamerica. So in Mexico, we have 18 agave taxa cultivated in Mexico, but that doesn't even count all the myriads of races and forms, so many of them. And their cultivation persisted relatively uninterrupted for centuries, but that wasn't the case for the Southwest and Northern Mexico, where even though there's numerous references on how people used agaves in this region, their importance was still questioned. And of course, there's very little data on possible pre-contact cultivation, despite the agaves are excellent candidates in these mineral deficient soils that are so characteristic of arid regions. And they are a reliable and stable resource against climate, drought, et cetera. And as we saw in Baja California, annual crop failures. Archaeobotanist Versilla Bohr, and she states, "It would only make sense that as important as agave was to people in Arizona, it would also be cultivated, as its use was too extensive to be sustained by gathering alone." And indeed, this all changed with the work of Susie and Paul Fish and Madsen and Charles Mixachek, and working up in the Gila, as well as along the Santa Cruz near Marana. And you're going to hear much more about this from Susie and Paul in February. But they provided the evidence for large-scale agave cultivation with finding all these rock mulch features, for example, rock piles, agave processing tools, macro botanical remains. And this was occurring over thousands of hectares. But they didn't find any agaves growing in there. As a matter of fact, the closest one occurs about 16 kilometers from the fields. So there's question as to what agaves were being grown there. And they thought, well, people thought maybe wild agaves, native to Arizona, Agave murphyii, or possibly plants that were obtained by trade from Mexico. So what agaves could have been cultivated by the Hugam and other cultures, and do they still exist? And these are two important questions. We know agaves were cultivated in this region, wild ones. This is Agave perii. Paul Minnis and Stephen Plogg first in the 70s suggested that something was going on with these very disjunct populations well away from normal distribution on the Mogollon Rim. And then Kathleen Parker et al. Showed it indeed, these plants were brought in from an area very far away from where they grow and cultivated. And another kind of Agave perii, the Huachuca agave, you have the mountain wild form and the lowland populations that we call the anthropogenic forms. And Kathy Parker and Gary Nabhan et al. Published on that. We're still figuring out who actually cultivated them. But it's great examples, though, of wild agaves being cultivated. And in the case of Agave huachucensis, relying very much on people. And then Frank Crosswhite and Dr. Gentry and Susie and Paul Fish, Priscilla Bohr also suggested Agave murphyii, the Hugam agave, may have been cultivated. It was found near archaeological sites. And indeed, this we know is not only a cultivar, but a domesticated species. This is a distribution of it in sort of in around Phoenix, but you also find these sites in Anatoanatum and Mexico where those occur in dooryard gardens. But those around Phoenix, they are out in what we call wild situation, but they are found around near archaeological sites. They're unique in that they produce bulbils in the flower stalk, and they initiate flowering during the winter, which was a time of fresh food scarcity for people. And this is a site along Queen Creek. You can see the rock piles here, not too far away is Agave murphyii. As a matter of fact, near this site as well is a bulk court. And you can find agave processing tools as well. Those are very rare, but you can find them. So in traveling down south along the San Pedro River, it's characterized with these beautiful floodplains and Pleistocene terraces. And there's a publication called Migrants and Mounds by Archaeology Southwest. And they did surveys along 60 miles of the San Pedro River. And they documented all the agricultural sites. And they're extensive. You have these beautiful man-made terraces. These again are rock mulch features and rock piles that vary greatly in size. Now, an archaeology steward, Doug Newton, a friend of ours, told us of a picture in this publication of an agave. So Andrew and I went down there, and sure enough, we found the agave. It was a different population, but growing still right in the middle of these terraces near rock piles. And with Bill Doley, we described it as and published it as a new species, Agave sanpedroensis. And remember that plant that was found near, not too far from Marana? Archaeological stewards showed us these plants, and they are Agave sanpedroensis. So no doubt that these agaves, this particular species, as well as probably murphyii and probably other ones that we'll never know, were being grown in the fields that Susie and Paul Fish had uncovered. Growing with sanpedroensis was another one. We're calling it CF phillipsiana. More about that particular species later. It looks a lot like phillipsiana. It grows with San Pedro agave. It's very rare. We haven't described it yet, but we do think it is another pre-contact domesticated species. So other Hohokam agaves that were cultivated and domesticated is the Tonal Basin agave. This was first found in Tonto Basin. It's on the periphery of Hohokam territory. And we named it Agave de la Maderi in honor and memory of Rick Delamater, who first told me about these plants. And since then, we've also found it in Verde Valley, this particular shot overlooking the Verde River, amongst numerous archaeological features. And no doubt the plants were traded between each other. And actually, Kathy Parker had done a study and definitely shows that there was trading of these plants between these two areas. Another one in Tonto Basin on the periphery of Hohokam territory is the Agave phillipsiana, Phillips agave, named after my good friend Art Phillips, who first told me about this plant. It's actually first rediscovered, we found in Grand Canyon, and then since was found in Sedona area, south of Prescott, and then also in Tonto Basin. And so you can see there's a lot of trading that was going on with this. This is a plant that grew in different climate regions, different ecotones, different geology, and grown by different people, the Hohokam, the Patayan, the Sinawa, and Sesro Pueblan groups. So it'd be a wonderful plant to study, further study. Outside Hohokam territory, we have two more what we think are pre-contact agave domesticates. And the first one here is Agave verdensis. We call it the Sacred Mountain agave. It's only found in the Verde Valley area near its namesake. And another one, the Agave yavapayensis, the Yavapai agave, also found with archaeological features, but restricted to Verde Valley area. And in the Verde Valley area, there are some very unusual agaves. This isn't unusual. This is Agave perii, but what makes it sort of cool is it grows about 20 meters from a major habitation site. What makes it even more cool is that Sacred Mountain and Agave phillipsiana, Phillips agave, also grows on this red rock knob. And to make it even more cooler are agaves that we don't even know what to call them. I thought it was might be a hybrid between Sacred Mountain and Agave perii, but the more molecular data does not support that. Is it something that just came up recently spontaneously, or does it have deeper roots with people? People were experimenting, people were trying different agaves. And these again are just the remnants of what we're finding here. We just don't know. So there's a lot of evidence supporting their cultivation and or domestication, and of course that close association with archaeological features that include rock piles and man-made terraces, agave processing tools like knives and scrapers, and then being found near field houses or multi-room dwellings, roasting pits, macroplant material, quids, pollen, etc. And so when you have this long interaction between human and agaves, you're going to have morphological, physiological, and genetic changes. For example, I mean, they're relying on humans and they produce very little. These domesticates produce very little or no fertile seeds or fruits. They rely on asexual reproduction, again, through underground stems or rhizomes and pupping. In the case of Agave murphyi, the production of these bulbils that are very well adapted to dry conditions. But they don't do well, they don't disperse as well as those light seeds that the wind carries. And so they rely on humans to disperse them. They do establish very well in disturbed soil, especially in rock pile features. So this is, one stalk can produce 200 to 300 of these bulbils. And you've cut off, significant time in their maturation process as well. So they could be easily traded and moved. So vegetative reproduction will result in relatively uniform morphology and low genetic variability. Also ploidy level. With domesticates, we often find with any plants, domesticated plants, there's often a correlation with increase in ploidy level. Instead of being diploid, you may be triploid, tetraploid, et cetera, hexaploid, whatever. And sure enough, in 3 of our domesticated species, we have polyploids. I think they're tetraploids. Andrew thinks they're triploids, so we may have to split the difference. But research has shown that ploidy level can have effects on traits selected. For example, increase in size and other other possible traits. And so this is a great area of research as well. So what are possible traits that were selected? So I have to preface this with a statement first. I'm looking at this through the lens of a non-Indigenous person. So it is biased. And so again, reminds me of the importance of bringing in Indigenous people, bringing in people, collaborating with people in Mexico, traditional farmers, to get a really good idea of what's going on. So having said that though, so this is what we're coming up with possible traits selected. In all of them, the leaves are very easily cut. There may have been selection in the harvesting and flowering time. For example, in the Sedona area, you have the 2 wild ones, Perion chrysantha, and then our domesticates, and the yellowish green shows approximate flowering, and the pink, the approximate harvesting time. So wild agaves do have a definite period of flowering, but they don't all flower at once. So you have a range of when they're ready to flower and when they mature. Not so with domesticated species. Within each species, when one's ready to flower, they all flower, which makes gathering, harvesting them easier, but it really restricts that window of time when you can harvest these plants. So in Sedona area, when you add these domesticates, all these different ones, you've actually extended the harvest time. And same way in Southern Arizona, here's the wild ones with flowering and harvesting time, and then our domesticated ones. You have Agave murphyi in the mix, that really extends the time of harvesting. And then around Tonto Basin area, when you add Delamateri and Flipsiana, those are July, August, September bloomers. So that too adds, extends the time, because Chrysantha and Peria are pretty much the only ones that are found, wild ones that are found in the area. Often we find the agaves in Tonto Basin as well as here in Verde Valley, more than one growing with each other. Here we have Delamateri growing with sacred as well as Agave Philipsiana. And so you can have these different agaves with different flowering times. Also, they could have been selected for different purposes too, for fiber, for food, for beverage, for medicine, who knows? But that's this distinctive possibility. You could be selecting for taste too, with 3 taste tests. All the domesticates were deemed sweeter and less fibrous than the wild ones. Perhaps we were selecting for large heads. Of interest, Verdensis and Yavapiensis are small agaves, moderately small, and yet they are extremely dense. They weigh almost twice as much as Delamateri and those of Philipsiana. There may have been selection for that. We don't know. Other possible traits, shorter life cycles, especially with the aid of rock mulch features. Agave Sanpedroensis at the garden, we think that can mature in 7 years. And of course, there's been a lot of work done on Agave murphyi, showing between 6 and 9 years with supplemental watering. And also too, we think they may have been selected for what we call delaying mortality. We know certain groups will cut off the stalk when it emerges, and that helps build up carbohydrates, and it also encourages pupping. And I've seen Agave murphyi, those leaves remain green for up to 3 years. And so, and it does encourage pupping. I don't know how it affects the carbohydrate after that length of time. That's something else that we can look into. And of course, they could be selecting for longer, stronger fibers. You look at the fructans and those proteins. Remember our agavins and marijuana. These help the plants survive drought and pathogen resistance. And so how is that manifested with people? Especially with fructans, they fill you up. They give that feeling of satiation. And also with that gut, those gut bacteria working well, it's gonna result in a general healthy well-being. And we don't know the effects of polyploidy too on the morphology and physiology, and what effects does that have on the people. Again, good areas of research. So how do you fix these traits? How do you keep them within these populations? Vegetative reproduction will do that, producing the neophytes or pups. But also too, Seth Pilsk did a really nice presentation on agaves and on Apache culture. And he reminded me of how they, and other indigenous groups too, and they look at plants, they look at the animals, very differently from us. They're all on the same level. They're all, there's no hierarchy. And so they don't want to overexploit these plants. And so they will encourage pupping and what they call protecting the family. And I think that is pretty neat. So how easy is it to fix the traits? Dr. Gentry commented on it. It's quite easy. The ease in which we can cultivate and transport them with these offsets can enable the farmers to quickly select and perpetuate a lot of different varieties. And so we think over centuries, the Hugam and other Arizona pre-contact traditions had that sufficient time to domesticate agave from wild native ancestors and fix those traits. So because of vegetative reproduction, we're actually looking at plants that are basically the same, growing in the same cultural context as they were hundreds of years ago, which is a really unique opportunity. And that can help us trace their genetic lineage to pre-contact cultivated ancestors and help us also to understand how they manage these crops. So Kathy Parker looked at Agave murphyi and Agave delamateri and looking at genetic diversity. And it's no surprise that they had lower genetic diversity than wild species, but they did have greater variation, genetic variation than the monocultured Forcroides and Teculana. And in the case of murphyi, this diversity is aided by bulbils, offsets, and occasional seed. And so she suggested that this diversity is very similar to traditionally farmed crops where farmers cultivated several varieties, they traded seeds or suckers or collected from the wild, and they grew land races at maintaining the diverse genotypes within fields. So you want to keep the traits, you fix the traits, but you also want to introduce genetic variability as well. So it's pretty complex. But with the decreased Hugam population and reorganization of populations, post-1450, what resulted was absence of care and trade, which resulted in loss of populations, further eroding the genetic variation, which led to decrease and near extinction of all the agaves once cultivated in their fields. And what we see are remnants of population species in once extensively farmed areas with all these mixing of genotypes. We see these in transformed, formerly cultivated landscapes to what we see today, this modern so-called natural appearance. But they aren't natural. These are what I call biocultural living landscapes. This is a site in Agua Fria, north of Phoenix. These in the circle there are two agaves. These are wild agaves that were cultivated by Hugam. And they produce seed, but they were cultivated. And those rock features are man-made rock features for farming, not only agaves, but other plants. So this is what we call a biocultural landscape. So what we see today is a result of what happened centuries ago. And what we call a legacy effect. So what happened way back then will have influenced plant species and plant composition for centuries. All those green, that green right there is Hordeum pusillum, little barley. And this was a plant that was cultivated and domesticated by the Hugam as well. And so it reverted back to its wild state, and that's what we're seeing now. So, and it was extensive, these kinds of biocultural landscapes. These are just rock pile features in Arizona in the shaded area. And you can see it corresponds quite well with Hugam, but other groups also use rock pile features. And in the yellow, that's the approximate areas of the Agave domesticates. And there are all sorts of types of landscapes. These are most impressive, the Safford grids found outside of Safford. And these are all these little gardens that are believed to have been used for growing agaves, as well as probably intercropping, growing prickly pears and other useful plants. We don't see any agaves grown there anymore, unfortunately. But again, especially like in the summer, if you have a lot of summer precipitation, this area is covered with plants like portulaca, purslane, which is a highly nutritious edible quelite. And then this site eluded me for decades, not far from my home. This is in South Mountain, Phoenix, and these are agave cotton whole gum terraces. Unfortunately, a parking lot, this is at a trailhead, a parking lot is in the middle of it. But you can imagine growing agaves, like Agave murphyi in these terraces. So in Arizona, the agaves do reach their most northern, pretty much, and a little bit into Utah, their northern limits of their distribution. We have about 24 taxa, 16 found only in Arizona, and half of those are domesticates. And we're striving, but there's still not as many species as Oaxaca, which has probably the most species of any place. So we look at the wild agaves. These are Arizona edible agaves. And then when you add the pre-contact domesticates, it greatly increases the resources for the people. And then when you add Agave americana, it increases it, as well as adding 11 species of wild species in Sonora. And who knows, there may be cryptic domesticates in Sonora and Baja California too. So you've really got an area with diversity of agaves. So one of the questions, where did they come from and from whom, when? It's very easy to assume that they came from Mesoamerica, like corn, beans, and squash that the whole gum cultivated. But remember our barley, little barley, work by Versilla Bohr and Karen Adams, showing no, this was domesticated by the Hookahs, separate, distinct lineage. And there are other examples too. And looking at our agaves, work based on morphology molecular, that Agave verdensis and Yavapaensis have possible affinities with agaves in central Arizona and possibly northern Mexico. And these are interesting species to me too, because these, they have normal meiosis, they're diploids, they do produce a little bit of seed in their inflorescence, and they have a compact, small form, which would make sense in where they are growing in north central Arizona. And so, and they weren't traded very much. And I wonder if we're catching this in the early parts of domestication, if they're what we call incipient domesticates, and if they were very, very special to the people, they didn't want to trade them very much. They kept them more close at home. So these are thoughts that we're looking at. Look at San Pedroensis, it's in a relationship to Agave palmeri and Agave philippiana. And this makes sense too. These are all long-leaved agaves too. They're occurring, except for philippiana, occurring in southern Arizona. And this suggests, of course, that the borderlands region's a really important overlooked area of domestication. So how are they doing? What are their population trends? What are their threats? Despite what some people might say, they are all rare. They're remnants of once numerous types. And the loss due is ironically to lack of care, lack of human involvement and care of the plants. Also development, housing, mining, agriculture, reservoir expansion, and a big one here that we're seeing, especially this past year, climate change. Just to give the example, so all those pictures on the left for each species, they're healthy and happy. Delamateri got hit hard with bush and salt fires this last year, and the drought and the high temperatures, daytime and nighttime temperatures, it really impacted them hard. Whoops. And in philippiana, the drought and high temperatures really hit them hard too, as well as, so there's a mining operation south of Prescott that's going in, and it will impact the area where the Agave philippiana grows. However, we are working closely, we being tribal people, archaeologists, and myself, in Forest Service people working with the mining consultants to help mitigate as much as possible impacts on the area that the plants occur. And San Pedroensis, it was impacted quite severely with the drought Interestingly, Murphyii, which I think is a more drought tolerant species anyways, is faring a little bit better, as does Verdensis and Yavapaensis. They're still not doing great, but they do seem to be faring better, which also adds a little bit more evidence, I think, that possibly Verdensis and Yavapaensis, oh, did they originate in that area or not? We don't know, but we're going to try to find out. So how do we mitigate the threats and save the populations? They can't be protected under the Endangered Species Act because they're human influenced, or under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. They cannot be assessed for redless assessment by the IUCN. And I love this quote by Martha Burgess. And should not these and other rare cultural species be protected? You know, where do we draw the line at the edge of natural history, quote unquote, where native indigenous people have been in contact with the plants surrounding them for hundreds of thousands of years? And it is not more natural to include people and plants important to their cultures as part of the so-called natural ecosystem. Collaboration is key. If we want to save these plants, and save the plants for future generations as well, we need to collaborate with Native Americans, the traditional farmers in Mexico, academia, including archaeologists, federal agencies, and citizen science. We need to make sure we back up these populations, taking excellent records, working with permits, working with agencies and all those they listed in collaboration, in getting them ex situ so that these don't disappear. And that involves live collections as well as herbarium specimens. And one note too, that on that herbarium label, this is a rare plant, and the locality is actually not correct, because there are people that would take the locality and unfortunately, try to collect them. We do have evidence of illegal seed collecting with the Yavapaensis and Verdensis. Collecting all of the these don't produce much seed, so collecting all the seed from all the plants from many populations every single year is not a good way to protect, conserve the species or the biocultural context. And then, of course, selling the seed to seed companies. Now, this isn't doing the plant or anyone any good, any benefit. So when we're not against allowing seed collection or having seed collection for the public to grow, as a matter of fact, for a lot of rare species, that is happening, but it has to be monitored, monitoring the effects of such collecting. It has to be in collaboration with the agencies and others, and with the correct permits. And it can't be illegally collected like that. So we do a lot of surveying and monitoring of these plants. We want to know where they are and how they're doing. We have monitoring programs with Coconino and Tono National Forest and Cascabel Conservation Association. They're doing wonderful work with helping us. Also too, I love these programs, and many several tribes do this with these linguistics and ethnobotany programs. And these are pictures of the programs that have been going on for a long time up in Peach Springs with the Wallapai, and teaching kids, as well as older people too, but teaching the kids of that connection, what plants were important to them and that relationship. And I love these programs. I think they're so important. And continuing a tradition, the agave roasts. More and more groups are doing these agave roasts and keeping the tradition alive. And I always remind myself, these agaves didn't just provide the food and all the other uses. With these agave roasts, yes, you're getting an edible food, but it was so much more than that. It reinforces cultural ties and identities. It allows people for many days getting together, sharing stories, and just being amongst each other. And so when you lose a food, when you lose a plant that's used for food, you're losing far more than the food. And what we'd really like to do, and this is a path that we're going down, is involving in situ indigenous people for in situ care of these agaves in the biocultural context. That's our what we would love to see happen. So there's a lot of questions. How many populations? How are they doing? The trends. When and where were they cultivated and by whom? How, where, and when did they originate? Who are the closest relatives? And how can this help us understand in the context too of crop wild relatives? You know, these are challenging times when we know in many areas increasing drought, higher temperatures, and our food sources will be impacted. So looking at these arid adapted plants will help us navigate through this, what we're going through. Are there additional cryptic agaves or forms we have overlooked? I would say definitely yes. And what additional traits were selected? This one I think is pretty interesting. There's more and more research on this, the effects of microbial life on the agaves. There is research going on with cultivated and wild species, and it's pretty cool. They do have an effect on plants. How can we mitigate threats and increase numbers in their cultural context? That's the big one. So in summary, agaves are very important to borderlands people in our region, both uniquely adapted to this marginal, quote unquote, and of course we know it's not, region of high biodiversity and to each other. Arizona, we have at least 7 and no doubt more pre-contact domesticates within their biocultural landscapes, providing additional resources to the indigenous people. And the borderlands region is, we think, an overlooked important area of domestication and cultivation of agaves, and that there was considerable sophisticated cultivation of agaves in Arizona. We're employing a diversity of species, races, and types of farming methods to, again, not only fixing certain traits, but also incorporating new traits and allowing for genetic diversity. And this is really important, requires collaboration for understanding and protecting these unique treasures. So I want to end up I've been asked often of my personal favorite books, and I never mention this. So this is an opportunity for me to mention my personal favorites. Everybody has their own, but these are mine. And I have to say, Agaves of Continental North America by Dr. Gentry. Yes, some of the taxonomy is outdated, and yes, we've added so many species, thanks in large part too to our colleagues in Mexico who are finding new species and the great work that they're doing there. But there's so much great information in there, these Dr. Gentry gems that I like to call it, where I reread and still come away with new information that it's like the light bulb goes off. Another publication was, of course, the Desert Plants Journal issue. This was back in 1985. It was published in symposium that we held at the garden. And there are so many topics covering all sorts, from pollination to genetics to rare species, so many. Highly recommend getting a copy of that. And another desert plants issue. This was by archaeologist Alan Ferd. It's a beautiful photographic essay of Apache relations with agaves. And this reminded me too of the desert plants issue of Frank Crosswhite's with Saguaro. And in this book I love, and it doesn't get a lot of attention, and I'm not sure why. So that's why I'm putting it out there. By John Hawker. We have actually used this book a lot in our IUCN assessment of the agaves and yuccas. It's called Agaves, Yuccas, and Their Kin. He's a retired academician, so he has a broad and deep knowledge and sense for like systematics and all, but he is just writes in often in a humorous way, but in a way that's accessible to the general public. Wonderful photographs, highly recommend. And because I have a captive audience, I cannot refrain from selfishly promoting my own book, Food Plants of the Sonoran Desert. But I do talk a lot about agaves. And if you're interested in the Baja groups as well, I do talk quite a bit about those groups as well. So this is, in the words of Howard Scott Gentry, this is the last slide, and it is time for the last truth. You see me held in the arms of this giant maguey. Actually, I am a son, or in my case, daughter, of Mayuel, the goddess of maguey. What I have told you today is what she told me to tell you. And if you know me, I do talk to plants, and I truly believe that plants talk to you or to me if we only listen to them. So that is my talk. I thank you so much for coming. I'll be open for questions.
Thank you, Wendy. That was awesome. And everyone is clapping at their home. I wish we could all be together to recognize that what such a wonderful talk that was. All right, we've got some questions coming in. Wendy, you can stop sharing your screen at this point.
Okay.
And so remember, if you have questions, please enter them. I'm gonna kick us off with questions. I promise I'm gonna try not to monopolize all the question and answer period because I have so many questions, but one really quick. This is a minor question, but just kind of out of curiosity, it's a nomenclatural question. Your use of the term mezcal. So for example, when you're talking about the agaves in Baja California, so smaller mezcal agaves. Help me understand, your use of that term there and how that relates to mezcal as the drink.
That's a great question. I have noticed there's different uses, like in Baja, the use of mezcal, but also in Sonora, mezcal is used differently, if I'm not mistaken. That's what I was going to look up what I wrote. There it is, as you can see with the Baja, there's interchangeable. So can you offer some insight into that, Ben? What you think? I don't mean to put it back on you, but
I mean, it was a true question. Honestly, I'm uncertain of it because I'd see it used in different ways. Part of me wonders if it's almost like, when you use cardone for columnar cactus, which is just kind of a generic term for such, and I wonder if it's something akin to that. It's all right. We can kick it down the road to other guests in the series too.
I'm gonna look that up too later and get back to you on that one.
Okay, cool. All right. Let me take a question from the audience. I said I promised I wouldn't dominate the questions. So here I'm gonna see if let me ask this one first. You mentioned the bushfire and these desert fires that we had this year in 2020 and that we're seeing increasingly, and especially after wet El Nino or heavy winter spring rain years. Question from Tim is, do agaves survive fire or range fire? And if they do, how is that? How do they make it through?
Great question. There has been a fair amount of research done on agaves, especially Agave pomeri, with how they react to fires. There's a lot of factors. The intensity of the fire, because a lot of times the fires are patchy and it's not uniform by any stretch. I would say that the more solitary agaves will be impacted more. When you get these big clones that you find with perii, and they're buffered. You have the sacrificial lambs on the outside of the clone. There's a lot of factors that play into it. I did notice, like the bush and the salt fire, this pattern of a mosaic of burning, and you can see it in the plants, not only agaves but the others. Some are more intensely burned, jojoba, others, than others. So, good question. It's complex though.
Next question is, So I'll just kind of read this here to you. Have scientists considered consumers of agave products as stakeholders who can be aware of threats and consume slash buy products in a more responsible way?
Mhm.
Since the demand of agave products is a threat, and I'll just mention that's a major theme throughout this series for sure.
I absolutely think so. And that's a very good suggestion too. Absolutely, yes. Especially, we know that wild species are being utilized. So absolutely.
Yeah, and I would just add that that is, that's one of the major goals we had with the whole tasting pairings with the lectures is to educate all of us, both in everything you shared with us, Wendy, but also in terms of how we can be better consumers. And makes a
Mhm.
huge difference who we're supporting with our dollars when we go to the store and whatever we buy. But in this case, it's even more of a proportional impact as we buy the cheap. Don Julio versus a $10
Mhm.
more bottle that really is the real stuff, and we'll get into that more later. Um,
Mhm.
Wendy Ezekiel Escura shares awesome talk. Congratulations and thank you.
Thank you.
And he shares this insight that I'll just read. Cabeza de Vaca, who crossed North America on foot from Florida to Arizona and Sonora, described the bison hunters and fishers of southern Texas
Mhm.
collecting a
Mhm.
small agave that was roasted in pits for a few days. The observation was done in the year 1529, and the species description coincides very well with Agave maculata, a small rosette that is easy to uproot with stone tools. He says this suggests that agave roasting was also common outside Meso-Arid America, and even in the southern part of the Great Plains, that they were
Mm.
roasting agaves. Have you come across anything like that? Or
I haven't, and that's really interesting. And that brings up a good point that, um, my the talk, our work is focusing on this region, but we haven't even looked at New Mexico, let alone Texas, let alone other areas. We so we think that certain agaves in Florida may have been brought over from the mainland and may be pre-contact agaves, domesticates, and Dr. Gentry talks about that. So this would be another that I think would be really cool to look at. Yeah.
very cool. Um, okay, a couple more great questions here. Yeah, maybe. So Frank Reichenbacher asks, how many of those 12 plus new species are you looking to publish in the next couple of years? And as an eager botanist, he asks, when is the updated agaves of North America coming out?
Good question. Um, I think to clarify those 12 new ones, and I may not have been clear. And was that slide that showed 12 in Baja um, and if that, so that's just the wild agaves that are known in Baja, and I think there were 11 in Sonora. But we do have several, a few in the hopper that we do want to describe as new. We need more material. I
Mhm.
mean, anyone that's studying agaves, you'll know this that the flower just uh, once, and so they grow in pretty difficult areas to get to often, and so they're tough to study. Um, but we are trying to get additional material for the plants for these new agaves that we want to describe, and there aren't 12. There's just a few of them, and also too add too because herbivores love them. And just when you've been watching these and they're going to flower and you need flowering material and you go back for them and they're eaten. And I can't tell you how many times this has happened. So that's another wrench thrown in the whole thing. And
And
as
that
far as the updated version, I don't know. Good question.
you did say soon.
June. Sure.
I'm sure you have this. You do this at the garden. I was reading recently an essay that Gary wrote about Dr. Gentry, and he went to Huntington with Dr. Gentry, and there was this agave with this great flowering stalk, and he pulled out a rope and tore it down and collected it. And to the shock of the guests there at the Huntington Gardens, I've been waiting for 30 years for this to flower. Um, and I'm sure you guys have that at the Desert Botanical Garden as well.
Mhm.
And that's exciting when that happens. Okay, a question here, and this is maybe we don't have to go on too long here, but it's a nice general question. If you could just talk a little bit more about agave in the sense of the use of fibers.
Yeah, that I'm not by any stretch an expert on that, but I do think that certain agaves were selected for with strength and length of fibers, and anti-rotting. Um, uh, Not sure exactly what how to prepare them, or not sure how they were used. So, so one thing I didn't mention, that when they roast them for food, they would, and we'll learn more about this too, I'm sure, in March talk. They would put agave leaves on top of the pit, and then you can take them off, and then with a scraper, scrape off all the green tissue, and then you keep them moist, and then get off all that green tissue. It's really important. If some of you folks watched Carrie Cannon's excellent talk on Wallapai use of agave, and she talks about that and goes into the methods of preparing the fiber, but keeping it moist and working with it. And so then you can use it for various products. And she was showing some amazing products. One that really struck my fancy, and I think maybe we could, well, maybe not do this, but I won't say that, but it was for catching rabbits.
Yeah.
And they're like 100, this net was 100 feet long. She was talking about this. And so it's like a rabbit drive. And so they're driving the rabbits into this agave fiber 100-foot long net. So that's why I say there's so many uses. And if you get a chance to catch Carrie's talk, she goes into it quite a bit.
The other one that you mentioned yesterday that I liked a lot was the agave match. So there's a kind of an elongated cluster of fibers that when a spark was lit, then it was used to then populate other fibers throughout the camp, utilizing those fibers. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, it was quite impressive.
I would just add too that in our February lecture that Susie and Paul, especially Susie, are remarkable experts on agave fibers, and I think we'll be able to get into that too.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to sneak in another one of my questions. So the bulbils, I would say the third form of agave reproduction, the ones that I think often gets overlooked, so fascinating, such interesting adaptation. My question, if I had to pick one right now, is can you talk to me a little bit about how the occurrence of bulbils is spread across the phylogeny or the family tree of Agavoideae or Asparagaceae, but really within the agaves, within Asparagaceae, and if there's a sense of, is it a multiple independent evolutions of, or is it clustered in a certain family? Is there any evidence of if this was because you mentioned it in Murphy as a close link with the domesticate and as a trait that's really ideal for people. Is there a sense that it originated in the family driven by people, or is this really just a thing that people have glommed onto and used?
You ask really good, hard questions there, Ben. I think that it was independently derived throughout the group. But having said that, it does seem more predominant in certain groups. When you find an agave angustifolia, and I do think that Murphyi is closely related to angustifolia, it may have its origins from that. And so, but one note too, that all agaves can produce bulbils if they're injured. If you injure that stalk, I've seen it over and over again that they'll produce bulbils in that injured stalk. What makes the Murphyi's, the angustifolias, Wilmerianianas in cultivation, so there's another factor thrown in there too. They produce it even undamaged stalks. The fact that we see Vilmariana producing, in cultivation, was this just one that was selected from a plant that produced bulbils and then offsets, through the nursery trade? I don't know. It's a good question, but I think it's independently derived. How common it is too, I don't think it's super common.
Okay. Let me see here. All right, I'm going to go with one, and feel free to punt this to the speakers for tomorrow night. But the question is, and maybe I'll add on a little bit here. So the question verbatim is, which agaves in the Arizona region are best for agave spirits? Maybe let me add more specifically, what makes a particular agave good for agave spirits?
I suspect it's the fructans. And the kinds of fructans and the amount of the fructans that are in the plant that's building up. Agaves have that very unique one, agavin. And so if you I suspect with a high amount, and how it's hydrolyzed as well. There's papers that look at that too. So when you break down the fructans into what they call a short chain fatty acids, and this varies as well with different species, that may have some influence for that too. I mean, it also, it begs the question, why are agaves taste sweeter in general too, right? So I don't know, but I suspect it's with the amount of fructans that are in the plant, the type and the types, but I think most of it is the agavin.
And I think that's an important point, because we may want to think about the size of the pina or the heart, and that's but that I don't think that relationship necessarily holds.
No, and we saw it with Phillipsiana, which is a big plant, but the heart is actually relatively small, and that's the sweetest. And then you look at Verdensis and you have a Piensis, those hearts are really large and they're very heavy. And they were sweet. They were sweeter than the wild ones, but they weren't as sweet as Phillipsiana.
Maybe to close this out here, one kind of last comment. So the question is, you didn't mention which I actually really love, the agaves being used as beverage or distillate or drink here in Southern Arizona. What is our understanding of if there was a liquid consumption of agaves in this region, Greater Southern Arizona? Yeah, and what is the evidence that would lead us to know or not know?
I think Andrew and I talk about this a lot. It just makes common sense that they would have used these agaves that were used for food for making pulque. I can't think of a reason why they wouldn't. And tying it in with ceremony, ritual practices, and we don't have any direct evidence. This is something we want to look into, but I would be shocked if they didn't use it. There's just, it would be expected that they would. And so you're looking at all your edible agaves to be used for making pulque.
That makes sense. All right, there's one last question here that I think hits on an important point and maybe allowed you to expand a little bit. You mentioned this towards the end of your talk about the loophole of protection for these species, but is there any attempt to get some legal protection for these ancient cultivars? And can they possibly be covered by some sort of extension of an archaeological protection, or what are the new policies we need to enact, and are there pathways that we can follow now, or do we have to just start thinking outside the box in terms of with policymakers?
Yeah, I think we have to start thinking outside the box, because these agaves they just provide unique opportunities for study, but also unique challenges. They are on the Forest Service sensitive species list, and on the Arizona agriculture protected species list. That's about it. Gary and I did try to list Agave murphyi. When was it? I think in the late 80s, I believe. And interestingly, as a threatened species, and interestingly, they said no, but it wasn't because it didn't deserve it. It was because of other priorities. And get back to us later. Well, we got back to them later, and nothing happened. But the irony, though, I want to mention this, is once it's listed, like threatened or endangered, it is really hard to study these plants. Then you have to really go through these permit procedures. And so would that tie our hands? Maybe in doing what we really want to do and protecting them in situ. And if we do, with that goal of involving Indigenous people as caretakers of these plants. So we don't want to tie our hands with this kind of, with that kind of protection. So I think we do have to think outside the box and coming up with how to bring in protection while also allowing us to, again, not only protecting these plants, but protecting that context as well too. So it's a big challenge.
Well,
good question.
We have new leaders in place that we may be able to push some of these things forward with.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You know, I think that point also, that question and that topic also gets at one of the things I said at the kickoff of this is that, you know, our context of conservation is so dichotomous between natural, preserved, and people, and there's no space for that. And we need to, if we're gonna make our way out of this with preserving as much biocultural diversity as possible, we gotta allow for that reciprocal relationship, which is, as you've described to us, is the really core of agave. So important directions to think on.
I think it's so critical we involve Indigenous people, especially. They look at the world very differently and in a way that would benefit so much. Without their engagement, I think it's just going to always be an uphill battle in trying to figure it all out, as well as protecting them too. Yeah.
Well, Wendy, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, kicking us off in such a beautiful way. Thank you all for joining us. So tomorrow evening, 6 p.m. Via Zoom meeting, please join us to continue the conversation with David Suro and Gary Navahan. Wendy will be there as well. So as many other friends, you can order this week's tastings of Mezcal spirits from Hotel Congress. Follow the link on our main homepage, tumamoc.arizona.edu/agave_series. The fun has just begun. So thank you all for joining us. Wendy, thank you again. Such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Enjoy the rain.